and some skips. Say hi, guys. Welcome back, and this is a very special episode of the Rational Thinking podcast. As some of you are aware, but maybe not all of you, we've been doing the podcast for a little over 5 years now, 130-something episodes, and
58.
I felt like I needed something to complete that trio of numbers, but I lasted. Thank you. And today, this live podcast will be the last episode that Massimo and I record together. Yeah.
I'm glad there was no applause.
Yeah. That went well.
Yes.
Massimo is
Retiring.
moving onward and upward to bigger and better things for some reason. It's an amicable separation, you know.
That's right. It's not a divorce.
We still love you guys. No, it's not your fault. Sometimes a co-host and a co-host just decide they need to live separately.
By the way, that also means that there is a job opening. So at some point, somebody will step in. But I think what's going to happen is actually the podcast will continue, obviously, with Julia. In fact, you guys already have had the first episode taped.
That's right. I taped my first.
After me episode. Yes.
The first episode of the post-Massimo era. Or the era of Julia, depending on your name and preferences. Right, I recorded an interview with Sean Carroll on the question, discussing the claim, the many worlds interpretation is probably correct. The many worlds interpretation of quantum physics.
Too bad I wasn't there. It's probably not. But anyway.
Yes, I think it'll be different, but it'll be good. And I encourage you to tune in and help usher in the era of Julia.
But today, we're going to do something different. Now, at some point we thought, well, maybe for the last show, Julia's just going to ask me about, the future of skepticism and all that sort of stuff that nobody really wants to hear about. So we figured, no, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do instead is, since we have had 132 episodes, lots of different topics and guests, we're going to actually revisit some of the topics and ask ourselves if we actually have changed our mind about something that we have discussed over the last 5 years. I thought for a second I'm actually doing one of those, all of Shakespeare in 60 minutes kind of thing.
Talk really, really fast.
Really
faster
fast.
than I already thought.
All 132, but I think that's not going to work. So in that vein, what about you? What's the first thing that comes to mind in terms of past topics that you might have changed your mind about?
Yeah, there have been a number of things that have come to mind. Either I consciously realize, I no longer believe such and such, or I listen to an old episode or sometimes read an old blog post, and I think, I said that? I didn't remember I used to believe that. So, yeah, there's a bunch. One that has been sort of on my mind recently is we've covered in various forms the relationship between rationality and emotion. And I have brought up this trope, which I've sort of helped popularize in talks as well, of the straw Vulcan. So the straw Vulcan is, I got it from TV tropes, sort of an archetype in TV and movies, and it's this caricature of rationality, the same way a straw man is like a caricature of someone's argument. And the straw Vulcan is the character in the movie who is officially the rational one, but what that means in practice is that he goes around sniffing at how illogical other people are being and refusing to partake of fun or love or appreciate beauty because that's not rational, and expecting other people to behave rationally and being flummoxed when they don't. And so my point whenever we talk about rationality and emotion, and I use this trope as an example of how society tends to view rationality. My point is that this is not rationality. Like there's no reason that you have to or that you should abandon emotion or fun or beauty or love in order to make rational decisions.
But now you decided that you do.
Are you wondering where you're going with this?
Yes, I'm wondering where you're going with this.
So I still believe that is a caricature of rationality and not the right way to practice rationality. But in the 4 years or so since I gave the straw Vulcan talk, I've just come to realize that it's less of a fabricated caricature than I had thought. Basically, because I've met Stromulkins. I keep meeting them.
Someone in the audience.
And I'm not talking about my buddy Mitch, who's I think in the audience, who has an elaborate and beautifully rendered Stromulkin costume that he wears to skeptic conferences, and it's really quite a sight to behold. No, I'm
Not an inside joke, but yes.
People should put a photo of it on the website. I'm talking about people who actually do like espouse rationality or endorse rationality, but go around refusing to engage in fun or beauty or love because it's not rational or not efficient or not productive, and also who sort of expect other people to behave rationally and then are surprised when they don't. And so I guess my revised position is it's still sort of a great example of how not to do rationality, how to do rationality wrong. But I don't feel anymore like I can complain about society fabricating a caricature of rationality, because I think, and this is more of like a genuine failure mode of trying to be rational than it is a slanderous accusation.
Okay, so there are actual struggles out there. That's an interesting. I mean, I actually agree.
Yeah.
And okay, well, we did start out the very first episode talking about rationality, particularly, of course, for a podcast called Rational Speaking. Particularly, we asked the question of why be rational, and I wonder if we've changed our mind. I don't actually remember what we said, so it doesn't matter. But I didn't go back and re-listen to it. In fact, I never listened to that. I never actually heard one of our episodes.
Once enough.
Yes. But why be rational is a good question, right? Because in fact, in other episodes, we did cover sort of the same. We went back to the same topic from different perspectives. For instance, we had an episode where we discussed with a guest that the situation where there are situations where it pays off not to be entirely rational, not to be, depending on what you mean by rational, of course, because it's not like the definition of rationality is in and of itself. That's straightforward. So this is not one of those things that I necessarily changed my mind about, but I have certainly refined my understanding of over the last 5 years. And I've sort of arrived to the conclusion that the answer to the question of why be rational is not necessarily because, let's say, it is what gets you the best answers about how to navigate the world. Because it is true, actually, that sometimes rational is likely rational people that are not entirely rational probably have a better life, probably have achieved more in certain areas than people who try to stick to the fundamentals of logic and rational thinking. I think actually went back to a debate that happened near the end of the 19th century. And this was when William James published a very influential essay, The Will to Believe, where he was defending the idea that it is perfectly fine to believe in things that don't exist or that possibly don't exist. He was referring to God, because that makes our lives better. James, of course, was a pragmatist. And at the time, the response that was provided by, and now the name of the author escapes me, but we'll post it on the podcast website. The response was, no. Believing, trying to believe only things that are real, things that are, acting rational, it's a moral imperative. It's not a question of you feel better about yourself if you do it or if you don't do it. It's not a question of you're gonna get ahead of in life better or not. It's a question of, to proportion one's beliefs to the evidence, as David Hume famously put it. It's a moral question. It's just unethical to knowingly accept beliefs that are in fact not true, things that are in fact not true. And I went back to that. And to me now it has become a question of an axiomatic question. It's, rationality is something that I want to do because I think it's the right thing to do. The consequence is more or less benign, which may not be rational.
Well, so actually, you described this moral imperative as if believing true things is sort of inherently good or virtuous. But I think at least what James was James one who defended the moral imperative? Yeah. I think what he was saying was he gave this example of a shipbuilder. I might be conflating a different
generic enough, yes.
who did not, he didn't try very hard to find out whether his boat was seaworthy. He had no reason to believe it wasn't, but he didn't, try to test that belief, and the ship sank. And James said, the shipbuilder, he didn't deceive anyone, and in fact, he believed that the ship was seaworthy, and therefore, he wasn't deceiving himself either. But he didn't try to find out the truth, and the problem with having false beliefs or not trying to not trying to ferret out your own false beliefs is that believing false things can cause even a well-intentioned person to do a lot of harm. And so you sort of owe it, you don't know what false beliefs you have, but you sort of owe it not just to yourself, but to the rest of the world to make your beliefs as true as possible so that you can do right by them.
Yeah, I suppose that's justification. Yeah, that's an extended justification for wanting to seek truth. So, but at some point, we all take, that is one thing that we discussed in the podcast a number of times from different angles. At some point, you have to start with some axioms about, or some assumptions about what you do and why you do it. And it's not like people have forever tried to provide sort of foundations to their belief systems, right? And this goes not just for, of course, religion, but even for things like mathematics or logic themselves, right? So we always have, and where do you get this from? And okay, where do you get that from? And you want to go down to the bottom, as the word foundation implies, right? That the idea that knowledge or that our belief systems are like an edifice, they're like a building. There is a foundation. And of course, if the foundation is not very solid, then the whole thing will come down no matter how good it is. It's pretty clear at this point that foundational projects in all areas fail. There's no foundations to logic. There's no foundation to mathematics. And therefore, there's no foundation to science. There's no foundation to any other belief system or way of acting. What it is so we need a different metaphor. And the metaphor that I prefer at this point was introduced by William Quine in the middle part of the 20th century. And it's the metaphor of a web of beliefs. Right? So knowledge and the way we understand the world is like a web of interconnections. And some of these threads are much more thick than others. In other words, we think they're much more reliable. So the basics of mathematics are very strong, or the basics of logic is very strong thread. Empirical evidence from the senses tends to be actually fairly foundational thread. Fairly strong thread, because without senses we can't do anything. We cannot read, a computer output or anything like that. And then there are things on the other hand that are threads that can be changed, altered, reconnected, cut out, that sort of stuff. What that does is it gives you the idea, a very strong image, that nothing is beyond criticism. Nothing is, by definition, cannot be touched. Even if, at Quine said, even the laws of logic themselves may have to be altered if we understand the world in a better way. But you don't do, but there's no place of the web where you actually rely completely and you say, if that goes, then everything else crumbles. Nothing ever crumbles because it's all interconnected in that kind of interesting way. So I think that is a better way of thinking about knowledge. And that to me was a relief, because once I embraced that, sort of then the entire issue of, well, but where is the basis for logic, mathematics, science, etc.? It just goes away. That question makes no sense anymore. And it's a question that people are trying to answer for hundreds of years, and they fail.
Yeah, that's interesting. This is kind of parallel to one of my own evolutions, which is we've talked a lot about philosophical thought experiments as a tool of reasoning, and especially in ethics, where a lot of philosophical thought experiments will force you to notice an inconsistency in your own intuitions. For example, a generic person, would be willing to pull a switch that would cause a train to hit one man in order to save the lives of 5 children. But I wouldn't be willing to push the man off the bridge to stop the train to save the lives of 5 children. And so, how do you reconcile that inconsistency? Or, I would consider it my duty to jump into a pool to save a drowning child, even if I ruined an expensive suit in the process. But I don't feel a moral obligation to donate money equivalent to the cost of the suit to save the lives of children who I can't see across the world. Is etc. So those are
That's the utilitarian argument from Peter Singer, who actually was one of our guests. Yes.
That's right. That's right. We should talk about utilitarianism at some point today too, because I think he's involved in that as well. But I used to be quite troubled by those inconsistencies, and felt like there must be a correct way to resolve that inconsistency. Just like you're reading about mathematical proof, and you start out with a true statement, and then you end up with a quite clear contradiction, like 1 = 2, and something must have gone wrong along the way. And so I felt like I must be able to find the point where things went wrong. So I think one way that my thinking about ethics has evolved is that I've just really internalized the fact that our moral intuitions did not develop they weren't installed from the top down, I think, and there was no reason for them to evolve to be consistent with each other. The different systems of cognition, of reasoning in our brain evolved somewhat separately from each other at different points in time, and in response to different evolutionary pressures, social and physical, etc.
So you would agree with Walt Whitman, who said that, so I contradict myself.
He forced me to.
I am large enough to contain multitude.
Well, I think that statement gets used as an excuse to not have to admit that you're not making sense. So I don't want to invoke it in this case. I guess I'm just saying that I have to fall back on this web of knowledge, or in this case, web of moral beliefs, and just sort of deal with the inconsistency in some way, but not.
So my approach.
Not like I can resolve it.
So my approach to the same problem has evolved in a different way, although not necessarily compatible with what you're saying. And it has evolved in part because of reading or listening to people like Peter Singer. I mean, Singer is a very smart guy, very nice guy, incidentally, and he's somebody who you definitely want to engage into seriously thinking about ethics. But you do come across these kind of things, and then you say, well, there really is no consistent answer from them for me to provide this. These are really situations where either you accept that most people are just really bad at ethical reasoning, or bad people, or there's something wrong with the approach, that particular ethical approach, utilitarianism in this case. By the way, of course, you all know this, but utilitarianism is, of course, that approach to ethical moral philosophy that says that the right thing to do is always what maximizes people's happiness and minimizes people's pain, or both of them at the same time. So it's a maximizing or minimizing of a particular quantity. And then, of course, we can have a discussion for the entire afternoon about what happiness means and how you measure it and so on and so forth. But the basic, more maximizing and under what circumstances. But the basic idea is simple enough. So it is thinking about these kind of things, and in fact, having Singer on the podcast that forced me, because he did come up with that particular example. In his case, I think it was the expensive Italian leather shoes, but close enough, right? That's the same idea. And of course, the response is now, forget the child, I'm going to save my shoes, right? No. That would be one way to be consistent, right? That would be one way. Now, what I think it's happening there is that another option is simply to reject that entire way of thinking. So we talked about this in the podcast a number of times. Philosophers over the last 2.5 millennia have come up with a number of what I call ethical frameworks. These are not theories as much as ways to think about ethics. Right? Utilitarianism is one. Deontology is another one. This is the idea that there are certain rules that are absolute. Think about Ten Commandments, of course, is a classic deontological system, but in secular terms, Immanuel Kant is probably the philosopher that came up with the most rational sort of deontological system. Then there's a number of others, one of which is called virtue ethics. It goes back to Aristotle and other philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome. And as you know, over the last several years, I've moved dramatically away from, I was never a deontologist to begin with, with all due respect to Kant, but he hasn't been there. But I entertain different forms of utilitarianism. There are different varieties, different versions of being utilitarian. And then I just came across these kind of problems we just over and over, and I finally said, this is not going to work. So the virtue ethics approach is very different because for the ancient Greek Romans, the question of is this the right thing to do? Is to donate the money that you would have used to buy your suit or your expensive shoes in order to save children on the other side of the earth. Is that the right thing to do or not? Would it be a nonsensical question that would not have been the kind of question that ethics is concerned with? The question ethics is concerned with, as far as the Greek Romans were concerned, is what kind of life am I supposed to be living? What is a good life? And by good they meant a moral life, not just a life of profiting and pleasure. So once you put it that way, then the entire thing, you look at the entire thing very differently. The focus becomes not specific actions, but you're nurturing your own character. You're trying to be the best person you can. You're trying to learn and think hard about what is the best way of being a good person. And then any specific action, any specific situation becomes its own test of your character. And so there's no rule, there's no general rule, there's no maximizing this or minimizing that, there is no set of specific rules. It's a question of, well, let me see. This is the problem that I'm faced with today and right now, and here's my best way, my best shot at it. And tomorrow the situation may be different, and I may look at it in a different way. I'm not saying that this solves those problems as much as it dissolves them, because it really makes you think of ethics in a completely different fashion.
I mean, what I was trying to say is that I don't think it's feasible to try to be a utilitarian in every respect and try to make all your moral intuitions align with utilitarianism, but I still think that abandoning it entirely is the wrong way to go. Like the thing that I see happening with virtue ethicists, whether they call themselves that or not, is let's say you hear about a tragedy happening on the other side of the world, and as a virtue ethicist, you might cultivate compassion for those people and feel sad for them, and you're practicing the virtue of caring, of compassion, but you're not actually helping them. Whereas by contrast, the utilitarian might, but I don't know whether or not they would feel emotion, feel moved for those suffering people.
It depends whether there's 12 organs or not.
Yeah. But if they donate money to save those people, then the people whose lives are saved don't care whether you felt compassion or not. They care whether their lives get saved. And so I think I'm not saying you practice virtue ethics this way, but I think it's because it's so much easier to just there are easy ways to sort of demonstrate compassion and caring that don't require you to actually try to help the world. And I think it's easy to fall back on those ways if you're not sort of pushing yourself in the direction of utilitarianism.
Yeah, but I don't think that actually is the way virtuality is supposed to work.
There's no directions for how it's supposed to work.
That's one of its advantages.
No,
that's right. That's exactly right. First of all, one of the misconceptions is that if you're a virtualist, you don't care about consequences. Of course you care about consequences. They just are not the overriding, the only criteria. Right? And for a utilitarian, utilitarians are also known often as consequentialists. And for a utilitarian, that's all about. That's the focus of action, the focus of thought. Virtue ethicists, or any other, I think, actually reasonable person, will take consequences into account, but they're not overriding. They're not the only thing you take into account. Every situation becomes different. So a virtue ethicist actually might send money, or it might do something else. It might, for instance, a thing that is important for virtue ethicists is this idea that we live in a society that is made of sort of expanding circles, which is actually one of the metaphors used by Singer, right? But if you live in expanding circles, it means that the circles that are close to you are in fact deserving of more of your attention than the circles that are farther from you. Not because those people are less important in any absolute sense, but because you have much less of an impact. When anything you do has much more of an impact locally. If you start, volunteering for your local organization as opposed to traveling the other side of the world. If you start behaving in a particular way that can serve as a role model for others in your own community, if you start whatever problems it is that concerns you, let's say poverty, poverty is everywhere. You don't have to go to the other side of the world to deal with it. It's also around the corner. And so the idea is not that you ignore the other side or you don't do anything about it. The idea is that you set your priorities according to different kind of criteria.
But there's lower hanging fruit. By many orders of magnitude, there's lower hanging fruit in terms of being able to reduce poverty or disease or suffering in general. in some parts of the world than other parts of the world. And in the West, we picked a lot of the low-hanging fruit, and it's just by any sort of reasonable calculation, it takes much more money to reduce poverty in the West because we're sort of out at the tail end of having reduced poverty than it does to bring someone out of poverty.
But that kind of reasoning brings you quickly to the idea that everybody here is being a really, really bad person because they spend money for coming in and actually listening to us instead of saving children on the other side of the world. And I resist that kind of look. I don't think you guys are that bad. See what I mean?
I think that's a common reaction to this kind of information, or this kind of dilemma. And the position I'm trying to argue for is not, like, I think what you're doing is you see the conclusion of this reasoning is, well, then I'd have to, like, either give away everything I own, or, consider myself equivalent to a genocidal killer. And that's clearly...
You think that's a false dichotomy?
Well, that's sort of like the logical conclusion of that train of thought. And that's, like, unacceptable and absurd. And so therefore I'll reject the entire utilitarian premise.
Right.
And what I'm trying to say is, no, the utilitarian premise still has a lot going for it. It's still true that, we can do a lot more good helping people on the other side of the world who maybe we don't see or feel compassion for viscerally because they're not in front of us. But we don't have to take it to its logical conclusion. That's what the I contain multitudes buys you. That you can,
Yes.
that you can be more utilitarian than you were before and do more good without having to be forced to accept the logical conclusion that you have to give away everything you own.
I see your point. However, I don't think that my objection to utilitarianism comes only from looking at the logical end of it. I think that way before you get to the logical end, you should really ought to start feeling bad about yourself if you're a utilitarian. You don't need to go all the way to divesting yourself of everything, which not even Singer does. Singer actually, to his credit, you don't donate a large chunk of talking something like 20 or 30% of his salary, I think at least, for good causes. But even of course, if you're looking at the logical endpoint, even Singer is a monster anyway because he doesn't give up 90% of it. But he's doing a lot. But I think that the problem actually comes much earlier for utilitarianism, much earlier than you get to the logical endpoint. You really ought to start feeling bad about yourself almost immediately if you're a utilitarian. That said, how about we change topic into another thing that I'm actually changing my mind about?
Oh,
yeah.
More?
I know, it's amazing, right? In 5 years, I managed to change my mind about at least 3 or 4 things.
I have to say, retention. I've been, like, repeatedly surprised how I'll be interviewing someone who talks about the importance of changing your mind and how you shouldn't be afraid to change your mind and, everyone's wrong about so many things and you shouldn't be ashamed of that, you should change your mind. And then I ask them, so when do you change their mind? And they're like, this happens a lot.
Yes.
It's just much easier to...
Wasn't that title
endorse.
of the book that we one of the authors of, everybody makes mistakes.
Right. Anyway, so I want to know what else you changed your mind about.
Okay, this is going to be very esoteric, I suppose, but I did change my mind in a fairly dramatic way about this one, and that's mathematical Platonism.
One of the first things we discussed.
It is.
At the first meetup where I hung out with you.
Yeah, it is everything, and also in fact, one of the things that made me change my mind is one of our guests, Max Tegmark, who talked about the mathematical universe hypothesis, and he finally nailed it for me. He convinced me that he's wrong. Just all right. So let me tell you this. So first of all, the basics, right? So mathematical Platonism is this idea that is in fact very widespread among both mathematicians and philosophers of mathematics. So this is not something that just a few cuckoos, unless you think of mathematicians and philosophers of mathematics as cuckoos, which there's ground for that. But the majority of practicing mathematicians apparently are convinced that what they are doing with mathematics is to discover things, not to invent them. Right? So mathematics is not a human invention; it's a discovery of something. Well, if it is a discovery of something, the question is, well, discovery of what? Where are these things, these mathematical objects? And that's why, of course, from there the step is very short to becoming some sort of Platonist. Plato, of course, was this the guy who said that there is a whole world of true ideas, ideal versions of everything, of which the current world that we actually inhabit is just a pale reflection, right? So it goes back to the image of the metaphor of the cave, for instance, in the Republic. Now, nobody today, or very few people, I assume today, is a full-fledged favorite. We don't think that there is an ideal chair out there, of which all actual chairs are mere copies. Or as one of the early critics of Plato put it, maybe there is ideal dunk out there, of which all pieces of crap are an instantiation. But there are modified versions of Platonism, and the strongest modified version of Platonism is mathematical Platonism. Is this idea that mathematical structures, mathematical forms are actually, in some sense, mind independent. They're not out there, it's not like you can point a telescope and discover them, but you can discover them in some interesting way. As I said, this is actually a majority position among mathematicians. Now, to the rest of us, presumably feels kind of weird, I would hope, right? But I was when we started the podcast, I was actually intrigued by this idea because it does have very good arguments to go in its favor. First of all, if the practitioners, the professionals of the discipline tell you, what, I can't explain this thing, but I really feel like the Pythagorean theorem or Math's last theorem or you name it was in some sense there for me to discover. I didn't make it up as opposed to coming up with a new game or inventing chess or something like that. Then you really need to take them seriously. These are the professionals. These are the ones that actually know what they're doing and how they're doing it. So they talk about the role of intuition in mathematics, for instance, the